I never expected to run into him that evening. Not at La Riviere, one of the most upscale restaurants in the city. But fate had a way of placing people in situations they least expected. The restaurant hummed with soft jazz, the warm lighting reflecting off the polished silverware and crystal glasses. I was there to celebrate my son Mason's 10th birthday. It had taken weeks to secure a reservation, but nothing was too much for my boy. Mason sat beside me, his small hands eagerly flipping through the menu, eyes shining as he debated between the lobster ravioli and the steak. Everything was perfect, until I heard a voice I hadn't heard in years. Well, well, well. I never thought I'd see you in a place like this. The voice dripped with mockery, sending a slow, cold burn through my veins. I turned my head slightly, already knowing who I would see. Daniel, my ex-wife Rachel's new husband, the man she chose over me. He stood at the entrance, his lips curled into that same smug smirk I had always despised. His designer suit was crisp, tailored to perfection, a stark contrast to the man I used to be, the man Rachel had once called a failure. I sighed, forcing myself to turn back to Mason. Tonight wasn't about him. It wasn't about Rachel. It wasn't about the past. Did you decide on what you want, bud? I asked, my voice steady. Mason barely had time to answer before Daniel scoffed, taking a deliberate step forward. Dining at a fancy place now, huh? He continued, voice loud enough to draw glances from nearby tables. Didn't think a high school dropout could afford this. The words hit me like a slap. Not because they were true, but because they were so predictable. The same insult, the same arrogance, as if education was the only measure of success. I clenched my jaw but refused to engage. I wouldn't ruin Mason's birthday with old wounds. But then Daniel's eyes flickered to my son, and his lips twisted into something crueler. Like father, like son, he sneered. I guess stupidity runs in the family. The restaurant fell into a thick, suffocating silence. My grip tightened on the tablecloth, my nails pressing into my palm. My first instinct was to stand up, to let my fists do the talking. But before I could move, before I could even process my anger, Mason spoke. His voice was calm, steady, almost cold. Dad, he said, tilting his head slightly, this man, he's from Titan Security, right? I blinked. Daniel's smirk faltered. Should we fire him? Mason added, his expression blank. The room seemed to shift in that moment. The low chatter of other diners faded into the background as Daniel's face twisted from arrogance to confusion, and then horror. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash. His smug confidence wavered, his brows knitting together as if his brain refused to process what he had just heard. What? He stammered, his posture stiffening. Mason turned to me, ignoring Daniel completely. We've been thinking about switching security firms anyway, right, Dad? I exhaled slowly, then finally leaned back in my chair. I met Daniel's eyes, watching as the realization finally set in. He had no idea. The same man he had spent years belittling, calling worthless, mocking for being a dropout. I now owned the company that contracted his firm. Titan Security was nothing more than a subcontractor for my firm, a small pawn in a much larger game. And Daniel? He was just another cog in a machine I could replace with a single phone call. I could see it in his face. The panic, the understanding that he had just humiliated himself in front of the one person who held his career in their hands. A flicker of anger crossed his face, but he swallowed it down, forcing a strained chuckle. You're joking, right? He scoffed, but the slight tremor in his voice betrayed him. Mason's gaze never wavered. Do I look like I'm joking? The boy was his mother's son in many ways, brilliant, composed. But he was also mine. And right now, I saw a piece of myself in him that I never expected. A quiet kind of power. I let the moment stretch, savoring Daniel's discomfort. Then, finally, I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. You know, Daniel, I said, my voice low, deliberate, I usually don't waste time on people like you. But insulting my son? That's a mistake you won't get to make twice. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. Look, he muttered, shifting uncomfortably. It was just a joke. No need to get all worked up. Mason tilted his head. Funny, you weren't laughing. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since I had known him, he had nothing to say. I pulled out my phone, pretending to scroll through my messages. "You're right, Mason. We should reevaluate our security team." Daniel's face drained of color. He took a small step forward, lowering his voice. "Wait, listen. There's no need for—" "Enjoy your dinner, Daniel." I cut him off. I turned back to my son, dismissing him entirely. And just like that, the moment ended. Daniel stood there for a few more seconds, shifting awkwardly, but when I didn't acknowledge him again, he finally turned and walked away, his shoulders tense. Mason watched him go, then looked back at me, a small, satisfied smirk on his lips. "Can I get the steak now?" I laughed, shaking my head. "Yeah, bud. Get whatever you want." And as we continued our dinner, the weight of the past lifted just a little. This was only the beginning. Back in middle and high school, I wasn't anything special. I wasn't the guy people pointed at and said, "He's going to be someone." I wasn't the smartest in the class. I wasn't athletic, and I wasn't popular. If there was one word to describe me back then, it would be forgettable. The only thing I had going for me was math. Numbers made sense in a way that words never did. While others groaned at complex equations and formulas, I saw patterns, logic, and puzzles waiting to be solved. It wasn't just about memorizing formulas for me. It was instinct. I could look at a problem and just see the answer, like it was whispering in the back of my mind. But that didn't make me popular. Teachers praised my ability, sure, but no one cared if the math nerd got a perfect score on his tests. I was just another kid in the back of the classroom, someone who existed but never truly mattered in the grand scheme of things. That changed when I met Rachel. Rachel was the kind of girl everyone noticed. She wasn't just beautiful, she was magnetic. The kind of person who could walk into a room and draw every pair of eyes without even trying. Her confidence made her seem untouchable, and in a school where everyone wanted to stand out, she owned the spotlight. We met in freshman year when we got paired up for a history project. She wasn't thrilled about it at first, sighing dramatically when our teacher called out our names. Rachel was a perfectionist, and she assumed I was just some nobody who wouldn't pull my weight. But by the end of that project, things were different. She was surprised by how good I was at problem solving, how quickly I could map out the research, organize the work, and break everything down in a way that made sense. It wasn't history, it wasn't math, but to me, it was just another puzzle to solve. For the first time, she looked at me as more than just another face in the crowd. By sophomore year, we were dating. I had no idea what she saw in me, but I didn't question it. Maybe she liked how I let her lead, how I admired her without question. Maybe she liked that I was steady when she was always pushing forward, that I didn't fight against her need to be the best at everything. Rachel had big dreams, bigger than me. She wanted wealth, success, influence. She didn't just want a comfortable life. She wanted a luxurious one. And I just wanted to make her happy. I wasn't blind to the fact that she sometimes looked at me like I wasn't enough. That she rolled her eyes when I said I had no plans for college beyond math. That she would talk about other people, wealthier people, with a sort of longing I knew wasn't just admiration. But I ignored it. I told myself we were just kids, that we had time to figure things out. Then, everything changed. One rainy afternoon in senior year, I got called to the principal's office. My heart raced the whole way there, my mind scrambling for an explanation. I had never been in trouble before. I wasn't the type. But when I walked in and saw my mother sitting there, her hands shaking in her lap, I knew this wasn't about school. She couldn't even say the words at first. It was the principal who finally broke the news. "Son, there's been an accident." The words barely registered. "Your father." And just like that, my world cracked in two. I still remember the details of that moment like they were burned into my skin. The way my mother gasped between sobs. The way the rain pounded against the office window. The way my fingers curled into fists, digging into the worn fabric of my jeans. My father had been driving to his favorite fishing spot, a trip he had made 100 times before. But this time, something went wrong. A missed turn, a slick road, a plunge off the side of a mountain. He never came home. Rachel came to the funeral, of course. She held my hand, whispered that she was sorry, that she was there for me. And I believed her. I needed to. But grief doesn't just stop when the funeral ends. It lingers. It spreads. And in the weeks that followed, the weight of it began to crush me. My mother wasn't handling it well. She couldn't work. Grief had swallowed her whole. The bills kept piling up, and it became painfully clear that if I didn't step up, we were going to lose everything. I made my decision quickly. I dropped out of high school. The choice felt simple in the moment. There was no diploma in the world that was going to bring my father back. No college application that could fill the empty spaces in our kitchen where food used to be. Rachel, however, didn't see it that way. "Are you insane?" she snapped when I told her. I expected her to be upset, disappointed, maybe, but her anger caught me off guard. "You'll never amount to anything without a diploma. You know that, right?" she continued, eyes flashing. I stared at her, really realizing, for the first time that she didn't see me as her partner. She saw me as a stepping stone, a temporary chapter in the story she was writing for herself. And in her story, I was supposed to rise with her, not fall behind. "I have to do this," I said, my voice hollow. She shook her head, frustration etched into every feature. "No, you don't. You're choosing this. You're choosing to be nothing." The words stung, but I didn't argue. What was the point? I had lost my father. I was about to lose my future. And now I realized I was losing her too. A week later, Rachel stopped answering my calls. By the end of the month, she was dating someone else. Someone with ambition. Someone going places. And me? I was just a high school dropout working 2 jobs to keep my mother afloat. Rachel moved on, and I disappeared from her world like I had never existed. At the time, I thought I had lost everything. I had no idea that this was only the beginning. Grief has a way of twisting time. Some days felt like they dragged on forever, the weight of reality crushing my chest with every passing second. Other days slipped away like sand through my fingers, disappearing before I could even register that they had begun. But there was one day, one moment, that would always remain frozen in my mind. The day I lost my father. I replayed it over and over, wondering if there was something, anything, I could have done differently. Maybe if I had convinced him to stay home that morning, maybe if I had gone with him, maybe if I had reminded him to check the weather before leaving, maybe. But no amount of maybes would change the fact that he was gone. And his absence didn't just leave a void in my heart. It shattered everything we had. I didn't have the luxury of mourning him the way my mother did. While she spent her days locked in the bedroom, drowning in her grief, I had to face the real world, the one that didn't pause for our pain. The bills didn't stop. The electricity company didn't care that we had lost the man who paid them on time every month. The landlord wasn't going to let us stay just because my mother was too broken to work. So I made the choice. I dropped out of school. I walked out of that building knowing that I was sealing my fate in the eyes of the world, that I was officially giving up my shot at a real future. No diploma, no college, no corporate job. But in that moment, none of it mattered. I didn't need a diploma to get a job. I didn't need a college degree to survive. And survival was all I cared about. The next morning, I went from being a high school senior to a convenience store cashier. The job was dull, the customers rude, the pay barely enough to make a difference, but it was something. When my shift ended at the store, I headed to my second job. A bar downtown had a help wanted sign in the window, and I had applied without thinking twice. I wasn't old enough to serve drinks, but the owner let me clean tables, restock supplies, and take out the trash. The hours were brutal, stretching deep into the night, but I welcomed the exhaustion. It was easier to collapse from fatigue than to lie awake with my thoughts. At first, my mother protested. "You don't have to do this, honey," she whispered one night as I stumbled through the door past midnight, my body aching from hours on my feet. "We'll figure something out." But I didn't see her figuring anything out. I saw the unopened mail piling up on the counter. Bills, overdue notices, final warnings. I saw the fridge getting emptier by the day. I saw the way she couldn't even step outside without breaking down. "Mom," I sighed, rubbing my temples. "We don't have time to wait for a miracle." I had to do this. There was no other choice. And so, my life became a blur of long shifts, exhaustion, and the occasional bitter glance at my phone. at the messages Rachel never sent. She had moved on effortlessly, slipping into a new life with a new boyfriend, never looking back. I told myself I didn't care. I had to believe that. Then one night, everything changed. I was cleaning up after a particularly busy shift at the bar when I met her. She was sitting at the counter, flipping through a robotics textbook while absent-mindedly stirring her drink. I had no idea why she had chosen to study in a dimly lit bar instead of a quiet library, but something about her caught my attention. Maybe it was the way her lips moved as she read, whispering under her breath as if she was in a private conversation with the words on the page. Maybe it was the way she tapped her pen against the table, completely absorbed in whatever complex formulas she was working through. Or maybe it was because, for the first time in a long time, I saw someone as passionate about something as I had once been about math. Her name was Lillian. I had no business talking to her, but curiosity got the best of me. "What's that?" I asked, nodding toward her book. She barely glanced up. "A nightmare," she muttered. I chuckled. "Looks like a math textbook to me." That made her pause. She tilted her head, studying me with an amused glint in her eye. "You like math?" "I used to." She closed her book and leaned forward, intrigued. "What do you mean, used to?" And just like that, a conversation started. Lillian was studying robotics engineering, something I had never thought twice about before. But as she explained it, how coding, circuits, and mechanics all came together like a living puzzle, I realized that it wasn't so different from math. I had spent the past year ignoring my brain, telling myself that none of it mattered anymore, that my life was about surviving, not thinking. But for the first time since I dropped out, someone made me miss learning. "You ever thought about going back?" Lillian asked after a while. I scoffed. "Can't exactly walk into a college class without a diploma." "GED," she corrected. "It's an option, if you really want it." I shrugged, not wanting to admit that the idea had crossed my mind before, but I shoved it away every time. I wasn't meant for that world anymore. I was a dropout, a bar worker, a guy barely keeping his mother afloat. But before Lillian left that night, she grabbed a napkin and scribbled something on it. A website link. "Just check it out," she said, sliding it toward me. "You never know." And then she was gone, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I stared at that napkin for a long time before stuffing it into my pocket. I had a shift to finish, a mother to take care of, a past to outrun. I told myself I wouldn't look it up, but later that night, I did. And that small moment, just like the day I lost my father, would change everything. Survival had become my only focus. There was no time for dreams, no space for ambition. Every day felt like a battle against exhaustion, against the weight pressing down on me. I was either at the convenience store ringing up impatient customers or at the bar cleaning up after people who had the luxury of drinking away their problems. I had convinced myself this was enough, that as long as the bills were paid and my mother had food on the table, I had done my job. But deep down, in the quiet moments between shifts, I knew something was missing. That missing piece had a name. Math. I had always thought of numbers as a kind of language, one that made sense when everything else in the world felt chaotic. I used to love sitting for hours solving problems, feeling the satisfaction of finding the right answer. But after dropping out, I had buried that part of myself, convincing myself it didn't matter. And then came Lillian. She was different from anyone I had ever met. She saw things in ways I never had before. She wasn't just smart. She was driven, passionate. She didn't study robotics because it was a good career choice. She studied it because she loved it. That night at the bar, she had left me with a simple napkin and a suggestion. "Just check it out. You never know." I had told myself I wouldn't, that I was too busy, too tired, too focused on real life to waste time on a website about education. But in the dead of night, when exhaustion and loneliness hit the hardest, I found myself pulling out that napkin and typing in the link. It led to a free online course on advanced mathematics. I told myself I was just curious, that I'd only watch one video. Then one turned into 2, then 3, and before I knew it, I was hooked. The spark returns. I started sneaking in lessons wherever I could. On my lunch breaks at the convenience store, in the back room of the bar, even on my bus rides home. It felt like something inside me was waking up. One night, after finishing a shift, I stayed up watching a lecture on binary algorithms. I had always loved binary. It was pure, simple, logical. I didn't realize my mother was awake until she spoke. "You're up late." I jumped, slamming my laptop shut. "I thought you were asleep," I muttered. She sighed, stepping into the dimly lit kitchen. She looked tired. Grief had aged her in ways I wasn't prepared for. "I haven't seen you like this in a long time," she said softly. I knew what she meant. She meant focused. She meant interested in something other than work. "It's nothing," I shrugged. She gave me a look, the kind only a mother could give. The one that said, "I know you're lying, but I won't push you." Instead, she just placed a gentle hand on my shoulder before heading back to bed. But her words stayed with me. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was learning again. A new direction. Lillian and I started talking more. At first, it was just quick exchanges at the bar when she came in for a drink after class. Then she started bringing her books, and before I knew it, she was teaching me. "You're a natural," she said one evening, watching as I solved a problem she had struggled with. I didn't know how to respond. No one had called me smart in a long time. That's when she brought it up again. "Have you thought about taking your GED?" I let out a bitter laugh. "And do what? Go to college? Get a fancy degree?" I shook my head. "I don't have time for that." She didn't back down. "You don't need a degree to be successful," she argued. "But if you want to keep learning, wouldn't it help?" I wanted to dismiss her, to tell her that I didn't need validation from a piece of paper. But deep down, I knew she was right. The more I learned, the more I wanted more. That night, I did something I never thought I would do. I signed up for the GED test, balancing the struggle. The next few months were brutal. Between working 2 jobs and studying, I barely had time to sleep. Some nights, I fell asleep at the kitchen table with my face pressed against my laptop keyboard. But I didn't stop. I studied math like my life depended on it. But it wasn't the formulas or equations that scared me. It was English, grammar, essays, comprehension. I had always hated it. Numbers made sense. Words didn't. I was failing every practice test. "You're overthinking it," Lillian said one night, pushing my laptop away. "You don't need to write a novel, just make it clear." She helped me structure my answers, breaking them down like a math problem. And slowly, it started making sense. When the test day came, I walked into that exam center feeling terrified. What if I failed? What if everyone was right about me? What if Rachel had been right? But when I walked out, I felt something I hadn't in years. Hope. A new beginning. 3 weeks later, I got the email. "Congratulations. You have passed the GED examination." I stared at the screen for a long time, barely breathing. I had done it. I had officially erased the title of high school dropout from my name. When I told my mother, she cried. Not out of sadness, but pride. And when I saw Lillian at the bar that night, she didn't even wait for me to speak. "I knew you could do it." I didn't know what this meant for my future. I didn't know if I would ever set foot in a college classroom, or if this was just another step towards something else. But for the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving. I was moving forward. And that made all the difference. Life didn't magically change the moment I passed my GED. The bills didn't disappear, my exhaustion didn't fade, and my mother's grief didn't suddenly heal. But something inside me shifted. I had proof now, proof that I wasn't stuck, proof that I could still grow despite everything I had lost. And more importantly, I had a choice. For the first time in years, I could decide what came next. I wasn't entirely sure what that was yet, but there was one thing I knew for certain. I wasn't going to stop learning, falling in love with the future. Lillian and I started spending more time together. It started with her tutoring me, but somewhere along the way, those late-night study sessions turned into long conversations about life, dreams, and the kind of futures we wanted to build. She made me realize something. I had spent so long thinking of education as a rigid path, diplomas, degrees, jobs, but she saw it differently. "Learning isn't about school," she told me one night. "It's about understanding, about solving problems, about creating something bigger than yourself." I had never thought of it that way before. But the more I listened, the more I realized that my love for math wasn't just about numbers. It was about patterns, logic, and problem solving. And there was no industry that relied on those things more than technology. Lillian encouraged me to take online coding courses, and as soon as I started, I was hooked. It was like math had come to life. Numbers weren't just numbers anymore. They were commands, programs, and systems that could build anything. I couldn't get enough of it. I spent every free moment coding, at home, at work, even on my breaks at the bar. And the more I learned, the more I realized that I wanted this. Not just as a hobby, not just as a way to pass the time. I wanted to build something. Rachel resurfaces. I hadn't thought about Rachel in a long time, but one evening, as I was leaving the bar, I saw her standing outside, arms folded, waiting for me. It took me a second to recognize her. She looked different, polished, expensive, like someone who had never struggled a day in her life. "We need to talk," she said. I didn't move. "I don't think we do." She rolled her eyes. "Don't be like that. It's been years." I sighed. "What do you want, Rachel?" She hesitated, then looked away. "I heard you got your GED." I didn't respond. "I guess I was wrong about you," she added, almost reluctantly. "You actually did something with yourself?" Her words were meant to be a compliment, but all I heard was condescension. Because she hadn't changed. She still saw me as the guy she left behind, someone who had finally caught up to her level. And I wasn't interested in proving anything to her. "Yeah," I said simply. "I did." She shifted uncomfortably. "Well, I just wanted to say congratulations. And maybe—" "Rachel." She stopped. "Whatever you're about to say, don't," I said, because I knew what was coming. An attempt at reconnection. A small window into my life, so she could satisfy her curiosity, so she could compare where we both ended up. I wasn't interested. Rachel had made her choice years ago, and I had made mine. I turned and walked away without another word. A new kind of family. Lillian had been watching from across the street. When I reached her, she smirked. That was satisfying to watch. I chuckled. I don't know why she even showed up. "Because people like her always want to see if they made the right decision," she said. "She wanted to know if she was right to leave you. And now she knows she wasn't." I wasn't sure how to respond to that. But then Lillian reached for my hand and squeezed it. "You're not that guy anymore," she said softly. "You're not the dropout she left behind. You're someone else now. Someone better." I looked at her and realized something. For years, I had been trying to prove myself. To Rachel. To my past. To everyone who had ever doubted me. But I didn't have to anymore. Because I wasn't doing this for them. I was doing this for me. And for the first time in a long time, I was exactly where I was meant to be. The start of something big. A few months later, Lillian introduced me to a tech entrepreneur she knew from school. He had started a small company focused on cybersecurity, and he was looking for people with problem-solving skills. "I know you don't have a degree," he told me, "but I've seen your work. And frankly, you're better than half the engineers we've interviewed." He offered me a job. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't high-paying, but it was a foot in the door. And that was all I needed. I took the job and never looked back. I spent every waking moment learning, absorbing everything I could, working my way up from a nobody to someone people relied on. And within 2 years, I had saved enough money to start my own company. Full circle. It didn't happen overnight. There were failures. There were moments of doubt. But I kept pushing. And eventually, I built something real. Something that mattered. I created a tech firm specializing in cybersecurity. And in a twist of fate, one of the companies that relied on our services was Titan Security, the same company that employed Rachel's husband. The irony wasn't lost on me. I never set out to prove anything to Rachel, to Daniel, to anyone. But life had a funny way of bringing things full circle. And as I stood in my office, watching my team work, I realized something. I had spent so long feeling like I had lost everything. But in reality, I had won. I never imagined my life would look like this. Not in my wildest dreams. Just a few years ago, I was working double shifts at a convenience store and a bar, barely making ends meet, with no future beyond the next paycheck. I had been nothing more than a high school dropout trying to survive. Now, I was the CEO of a cybersecurity company that was growing faster than I could have ever anticipated. My team was small but brilliant, made up of people who, like me, had started from nothing and worked their way up. We weren't just running a business, we were building something that mattered. And yet, none of it compared to my greatest achievement. My son, Mason. From the moment he could talk, it was clear he was different. I knew kids could be smart, but Mason was on another level. At 4, he was solving simple equations. By 6, he was explaining binary code to me like it was second nature. He had inherited my love for numbers, but he had something even more, an unshakable confidence that I never had at his age. Maybe it was because he had never been told he wasn't enough. Maybe it was because he had never been abandoned by someone who once loved him. Or maybe it was because I had made a promise to never let him feel like I did growing up. Whatever the reason, my son was brilliant. And as he grew older, that brilliance only became more undeniable. At 8, he started coding. At 9, he was developing his own small programs. And by 10, he had built something that changed everything. The birth of something new. It started with a simple idea. One afternoon, Mason was sitting in my office, flipping through an old photo album. He stared at the faded pictures, running his small fingers over the edges. "I don't like this," he said suddenly. I looked up from my laptop. "What do you mean?" "I don't like that pictures disappear. They get old. They get lost. They fade." I nodded, knowing exactly what he meant. After losing my father, I had held onto every photograph, every little scrap of memory, terrified that one day they would be gone too. "So what do we do about it?" I asked. Mason thought for a moment. "We make something better." And just like that, his first real project was born. It started as a basic digital photo album, but as he worked on it, he kept adding more. Encryption, cloud storage, AI-generated enhancements. He wasn't just creating a photo app. He was building a way to preserve memories forever. And the best part? He wasn't just doing it for himself. "Other people lose pictures too, right?" he asked one evening. "Yeah, bud. They do. Then we should help them." It was such a simple, yet profound statement. And that was when I realized Mason wasn't just smart. He had the heart of a true innovator. From project to business. At first, it was just a father-son project. We worked on it together after school, bouncing ideas off each other, testing different features. But then one of my business partners saw what Mason was building. "This is incredible," he said, watching as Mason explained the interface. "Do you know how many people would pay for something like this?" I laughed, shaking my head. "He's 10. And smarter than half the developers I've worked with," my partner replied. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a fun experiment. This was something real. So we launched it. Not as a toy, not as a hobby, as a business. And within 6 months, it was making more money than I had ever expected. The inevitable conflict. Success brings a lot of things: pride, excitement, opportunity. But it also brings jealousy. I knew that all too well. So when I ran into Daniel again, Rachel's husband, I wasn't surprised by his reaction. We were at an upscale restaurant, celebrating Mason's 10th birthday. I had made sure it was a night he would remember. His favorite food, his favorite people, a place where he could feel special. And then, as fate would have it, we ran into them. Daniel and Rachel, sitting just a few tables away. Daniel's smirk was instant, arrogant, condescending. "Didn't think a high school dropout could afford a place like this," he said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. I ignored him. I had nothing to prove to him, but then he turned his attention to Mason. "Like father, like son. I guess stupidity runs in the family." The words rang out, sharp and cruel. I felt a rush of anger so intense it nearly overwhelmed me. But before I could react, Mason spoke. His voice was steady, cold. "Dad, this man, he's from Titan Security, right?" Daniel's smirk wavered. "Should we fire him?" The restaurant went silent. I could feel the shift in the air, the realization dawning on Daniel's face as he put the pieces together. The same dropout he had mocked was now the owner of the company that contracted his firm. The man he had belittled for years could now end his career with a single decision. Daniel paled. What?" he stammered. Mason turned to me, his expression unreadable. "We've been thinking about switching security firms anyway, right, Dad?" I let the silence stretch. Let Daniel feel the weight of his mistake. Then I exhaled, leaning back in my chair. "Enjoy your dinner, Daniel," I said, dismissing him without another word. He stood there for a long moment, his face shifting from arrogance to panic. And then he walked away. Mason looked up at me, his lips twitching. "Can I get the steak now?" I laughed. "Yeah, bud. Get whatever you want." Because at that moment, I realized something. I had spent years feeling like I had to prove myself to Rachel, to the world, to the ghosts of my past. But I didn't need to anymore, because I had already won. I used to think the worst kind of pain was failure, that the feeling of falling short, of being looked down on, of hearing people whisper that I wasn't good enough, that was the worst thing anyone could endure. But I was wrong. The worst pain wasn't failure. It was loss. And I learned that the hard way. A love that changed everything. I never planned to fall in love again after Rachel. Not after the way she had left me when I needed her the most. I had convinced myself that love wasn't for people like me, people who had already been discarded once. But then Lillian came along. She never saw me as broken, never looked at me like I was a man who had lost everything. To her, I was someone capable of rebuilding, someone with potential. She believed in me before I even knew how to believe in myself. She was there for every late-night study session, every exhausted rant about work, every moment of self-doubt. And eventually, she became my everything. We built a life together. Not a perfect one, not one without struggles, but one built on respect, trust, and ambition. And when we had Mason, I truly thought, I had finally outrun my past. But life doesn't work that way. Because just when I started to believe that I had finally won, I lost her. The diagnosis. It started as something small. A few headaches here and there. "I think I just need more sleep," she had said with a tired smile. Then came the dizziness. The memory lapses. The days where she struggled to find the right words. The weeks where she barely had the energy to get out of bed. And then, one night, when she collapsed in the kitchen, I knew it wasn't just exhaustion. We went to the doctor the next morning. I remember sitting in that cold office, my fingers curled into fists as the doctor spoke. "It's a tumor," he said gently. "A brain tumor." The words didn't make sense. Lillian wasn't sick. She was the strongest person I knew. But as I looked at her, at the fear in her eyes that she was trying so hard to hide, reality hit me like a truck. This wasn't something we could fix. This wasn't something we could outsmart. This was a countdown. 6 months. That's what the doctor gave us. 6 months, maybe more if the treatment helps, he said, like it was just another fact, just another number. But to me, it was a death sentence. I didn't tell Mason right away. How could I? How do you tell a child that the person they love most in the world is dying? Lillian, though, she was stronger than me. "We tell him," she said firmly. "He deserves to know." I hated it. I hated every second of that conversation. Watching Mason's face change, his small hands curling into fists, his voice breaking as he said, But Mom, you can't." I wanted to lie to him. I wanted to promise him that everything would be okay. But I couldn't. Because it wouldn't be. The fight. Lillian wasn't the type to give up. Even with a tumor growing inside her, even with the doctors telling her the odds, she fought. She went through the surgeries, the treatments, the endless cycle of pain and exhaustion. And through it all, she still smiled. "I'm not afraid," she told me one night as we lay in bed. "I just don't want to leave you two alone." "Don't talk like that," I snapped, my voice harsher than I meant it to be. She just squeezed my hand. "Promise me something," she whispered. "Anything. Help Mason reach his full potential. Don't let my death break you." I wanted to tell her that there would be no death, that she would be fine. But we both knew better. So instead, I made a promise. One that I intended to keep. The goodbye. Lillian made it 7 months. 7 months of pain, of strength, of quiet moments where we held on to each other like we could will time to stop. But time doesn't stop for anyone. And on a cold January morning, I woke up to find that she was gone. She had slipped away in her sleep, just like she always said she wanted to. No pain, no struggle, just peace. But for Mason and me, there was no peace. There was only grief, and it threatened to swallow us whole. picking up the pieces. The days after her funeral blurred together. I went through the motions, handling the calls, the paperwork, the condolences from people who barely knew her. But Mason? Mason was angry. She promised she wouldn't leave us, he yelled one night, slamming his fists against the kitchen table. I wanted to tell him that she hadn't had a choice, that life didn't care about promises, but I couldn't. So instead, I held him as he cried. And when he finally fell asleep, exhausted from his own grief, I whispered the same promise I had made to Lillian. I won't let this break us. It wasn't just something I said. It was something I had to believe. Because if I broke, Mason would too. And that wasn't an option. A new purpose. Lillian's death didn't just leave a hole in our lives. It left a mission. She had wanted Mason to reach his full potential, and I was going to make sure that happened. So I threw myself into work, not as an escape, but as a way to build something that mattered. And Mason? He buried himself in learning, just like his mother had always encouraged him to do. He wasn't just brilliant. He was determined. He took his grief and turned it into creation. And that was how, at 10 years old, he built the app that would change everything. An app that preserved memories, that made sure nothing was ever truly lost. He built it for her. And I knew, deep in my soul, that she would have been proud. Because even though she was gone, her legacy lived on. Through Mason. Through me. Through the future we were still building. Together. Loss changes a man. It strips him down to his rawest form, leaving him to decide, break or rebuild. I had chosen to rebuild. Not because I was strong, not because I had some grand vision, but because I had no choice. Mason needed me. And even in my darkest moments, I knew one thing for certain. I would not fail my son. After Lillian's death, our home felt different. It wasn't just the emptiness of her absence, but the silence. She had filled every room with energy, with ideas, with life. Without her, it was like the air itself had grown heavier. Mason dealt with it the way he knew best, by creating. His mind had always been extraordinary, but after losing his mother, it was like he had tapped into something even deeper. While other kids spent their weekends playing video games or watching cartoons, Mason was hunched over his laptop, building. "Dad," he said one evening, eyes gleaming with that sharp, intelligent focus that reminded me so much of Lillian. "I think I've made something useful." I set my coffee down and leaned over his shoulder. His screen was filled with lines of code, unfamiliar and complex. "What am I looking at?" I asked. He grinned. "A way to save memories forever." At first, I thought he was joking, but then he explained. Photos get lost, right? Phones break, hard drives fail. But if we create an encrypted digital vault, people can store their most important memories where they'll never disappear. He turned the laptop toward me, showing a demo of the app. It was simple but elegant, an interface designed for ease and security. "I call it EverVault," he said. I stared at him, speechless. He was 10 years old, and he had just invented something revolutionary. A father's pride. I had never been more proud of him, not just for his intelligence, but for the way he was using it. He wasn't building for money or recognition or ego. He was building because he wanted to help people. "I don't want anyone else to feel like I do," he admitted one night. "I don't want them to lose the people they love and have nothing left of them." And that was when I knew this wasn't just a project. This was a mission. So we worked on it together. I used my knowledge of cybersecurity to help him refine it, while he handled the programming. We spent late nights testing, fixing glitches, improving the encryption. And by the time he turned 11, EverVault was ready. The launch. I had contacts in the tech industry, people who had seen my rise from dropout to CEO and respected my instincts. So when I pitched my son's app, they listened. Some were skeptical. "A kid built this? Is this even legal? What kind of security are we talking about?" But then Mason walked into the boardroom, confident, composed, fearless. He didn't wait for me to speak. He explained the algorithm himself. He broke down the encryption methods and how EverVault was safer than existing cloud storage solutions. By the time he finished, the room was silent. Then one of the investors leaned forward, tapping his pen against the table. "How much do you need to take this to market?" I nearly laughed at the look on Mason's face. He hadn't expected to get this far. I don't know, he admitted. The investor smiled. Then let's find out. And just like that, Evervault had funding. The success that followed. We launched within 6 months. And within the first 3 months, it had over 500,000 downloads. Tech blogs started writing about it. Major corporations reached out, asking about enterprise-level solutions. It was a runaway success. But Mason? He didn't care about the money, the attention, or the industry buzz. He cared about the people using it. He read every email, every review, every message from users saying how Evervault had helped them preserve priceless memories. Mom would have liked this, right? He asked me one night. I swallowed the lump in my throat. She would have been proud of you, Mason. More than you'll ever know. Rachel and the reckoning. With success came attention. And with attention came people from the past. It had been years since I had last spoken to Rachel. I hadn't thought about her much, not since I had left her standing outside that bar. But one evening, as I was leaving a meeting, I got a text from an unknown number. Rachel, we need to talk. I debated ignoring it, but curiosity won. We met at a quiet cafe downtown. She looked the same, polished, elegant, entitled. I saw the news about Mason, she said, her voice carefully neutral. And she hesitated, then sighed. I made a mistake. I raised an eyebrow. Which one? She swallowed, looking uncomfortable. I shouldn't have left you. I should have believed in you. And I should have been there for Mason. I leaned back in my chair, studying her. There was a time when I would have desperately wanted to hear those words. Now, I felt nothing. I don't need your apology, I said. And neither does Mason. Rachel frowned. But you walked away when things got hard, I interrupted. You made your choice, and we moved on. She stared at me for a long moment, realization dawning in her eyes. You really don't care anymore, do you? She whispered. I gave her a small smile. Not even a little. Rachel had once been my entire world. Now, she was just a footnote in my story. And as I left that cafe, I felt lighter than I had in years. A legacy worth fighting for. Mason and I visited Lillian's grave that weekend. He placed a small tablet by her headstone, Evervault open on the screen. Mom, I made this for you, he whispered, so no one ever forgets the people they love. I put a hand on his shoulder, feeling the weight of everything we had built, everything we had lost, and everything we had gained. Lillian's dream had been for Mason to reach his full potential, and he had. But more importantly, he had helped the world in the process. And as we stood there, watching the sunset, I knew one thing for certain. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were thriving. Success doesn't erase pain. It doesn't undo the past. It doesn't bring back the people we've lost. But it does something just as powerful. It proves that the past doesn't define us. Mason and I had built something incredible together. Evervault had become more than just an app. It was a movement. People weren't just using it to store memories. They were using it to preserve entire legacies. Families, businesses, even historical archives had started reaching out, wanting to secure their most precious moments forever. But with success came challenges. And one of them was Titan Security. I had never thought much about the security firms we contracted. They were just another layer of protection for our data. Another checkbox in the long list of things that kept our company running. Until one day, Mason came into my office, looking both amused and irritated. Dad, we have a problem. I looked up from my desk. What is it? He tossed a printed email onto my desk. I scanned it quickly. Titan Security had suffered a cyber breach, and somehow they were blaming us. At first, I thought it was a joke. Then I saw the name at the bottom of the email. Daniel Wright, head of cybersecurity, Titan Security. Of course. Of all the firms in the world, it had to be his. I sighed, rubbing my temples. What exactly are they accusing us of? Mason smirked. They think we hacked them. I let out a dry chuckle. Oh, that's rich. Mason nodded. They're panicking, and they need a scapegoat. The confrontation. I didn't waste time. I called for a meeting with Titan Security's executives. When I walked into the boardroom, Daniel was already there. He looked the same. Smug, arrogant, still under the delusion that he was important. But when he saw me, that arrogance faltered. You, he muttered under his breath. I smirked. It's been a while, hasn't it, Daniel? He forced a laugh. Look, this is a misunderstanding. But the fact remains, there was a breach, and all signs point to Evervault. Mason, sitting beside me, scoffed. Your system got hacked because your encryption is outdated, he said bluntly. It had nothing to do with us. Daniel's jaw clenched. Listen, kid. That kid just traced the breach back to your team. I cut in, sliding a file across the table. One of your own employees sold access to a third party. We have the logs to prove it. Silence. Daniel's face went pale. One of the Titan security executives turned to him, his expression dark. Is this true? Daniel swallowed hard. He had no answer, because he had just realized something. He had picked a fight with the wrong people. I leaned forward, my voice low and controlled. You tried to use us as a scapegoat. That was your first mistake. But trying to mess with my company, my son, that was your last mistake. I turned to the executives. Titan Security is no longer under contract with Evervault. Effective immediately. Daniel's eyes widened. Wait. I stood. Enjoy your job while you still have it, Daniel. If I were you, I'd start looking for another one. I walked out without another word. Mason followed me, grinning. That was fun. I laughed. It was overdue. That night, Titan Security's stock dropped. And Daniel? Well, let's just say his resignation was announced the next morning. Rachel returns, again. I should have known that Rachel would come back after that. She always had a way of sniffing out opportunity. A few days after the Titan Security fallout, I got a text. Rachel, can we meet? It's important. I ignored it. An hour later, I got another. Rachel, it's about Mason. That was the only way she could have gotten my attention. So I agreed to meet her. When I walked into the cafe, she was already sitting at a table, perfectly manicured nails tapping against her coffee cup. I heard about the Titan Security thing, she said, watching me carefully. I'm sure you did. She hesitated. Look, I made mistakes, but I want to be in Mason's life again. I raised an eyebrow. You mean now that he's successful? She flinched. That's not fair. Isn't it? I asked, my voice cold. Where were you when he lost his mother? Where were you when he was building something amazing? You didn't care then. Rachel sighed. I do care. I didn't know how to come back. I stared at her for a long moment. Mason is old enough to decide for himself. But if you ever hurt him, if you ever let him down again, I swear, this will be the last conversation we ever have. She swallowed hard. I won't mess this up, she whispered. For his sake, I hope that's true. I walked away, not knowing if she would keep her word. But I knew one thing. Mason didn't need her. He had already become more than she had ever imagined. The legacy we were building. Mason and I had been through hell together. We had lost Lillian. We had rebuilt our lives from nothing. We had faced down the people who once doubted us. And we had won. But success wasn't the goal. Building something that mattered, that was. One night, as we sat in the office working late, Mason looked up from his laptop. Dad, do you think people will remember us? I smiled. I think they'll remember what we built. And that was more than enough. Because at the end of the day, we weren't just creating a company. We were creating a legacy.